Last night, Roy of Roy Reads Everything, one of my favorite sites on BookTube, tagged me for the Shakespeare book event, something I didn't even know existed, but since I've loved Shakespeare most of my life, I will respond to the questions. First question, describe your first experience reading Shakespeare. It was absolutely miserable. My parents were planning to take me to A Winter's Tale, a dauntingly complex play, and thought, well, let's give him an advantage and give him a copy of the book to read before the play. I tried to read it. I had never experienced Elizabethan English. It felt like Greek to me. I could not understand anything except a husband was suddenly furious at his wife and saying lots of cruel things, and a statue comes to life. But aside from that, I got nothing. The play didn't help at all. But it did help me in that it sensitized me for the rest of my life to the fact that people who encounter Shakespeare for the first time often have a staggering time getting inside the text, since the linguistic challenges of Elizabethan English are kind of formidable. But here's the good news. The difficulties disappear by the time you've watched just 10 Shakespeare videos or 10 Shakespeare plays, and then you can get inside of the plays and they come alive in such an astonishing and wonderful and transforming way. Has the reading of a Shakespeare play ever brought you to tears? Yes, several times when we have watched King Lear in his growing dementia and arrogance bring the world around him to smash, and at the same time face up to the fact that he hasn't been much of a king and hasn't been much of a father, and starts paying the consequence for his last awful decision of which of you shall we say doth love us most, where we may extend the biggest bounty, that question of inheritance that in a kingdom is guaranteed to raise civil war and to have decent people turn into fawning sycophants. Sir, I love you more than words can wield the matter. Me, I love you more than my sister. Cordelia's candor to her father. I love you according to my bond. Lear's failure to understand the love and truthfulness behind that utterance, and vilification and separation from his most caring daughter, Cordelia, is heartbreaking throughout. But the final scene where she is dead, we know she's dead, Lear knows she's dead, but is still holding on to hope. Anyone who's lost a loved one knows exactly what that is about. And he holds a feather up to her mouth to see if she's still breathing, and says, this feather stirs. Just 3 words, only 3 words, but in those 3 words, this feather stirs. She lives, is such a coalescence of the energies and pathos of the play. And yes, I sobbed. But I have another answer too, and that's there are 37 plays, extant plays by Shakespeare. I wish we had a copy of Gardino or Love's Labour's one. Incidentally, to the answer, what play would you most like to see staged? I would like to see Gardino or Love's Labour's one. Fat chance that's not on. That's an item on my bucket list that's not going to make it unless some terribly serendipitous literary detective opens the right volume and finds a little quarto slipped inside. It would be wonderful. I doubt it will happen. But back to the issue of pathos and crying and what that means. One of my favorite paintings in all the world is John Everett Millet's portrait of Ophelia as she lays drowned. It's famous for, among other things, the intense naturalist detail of the scene where she seems immersed in this vibrant life world as she has slipped away. But when I've seen the painting in person, listen to what people are saying around me, and the comment that, Mom, she's not really dead. Dad, I don't think she's dead. You hear it all the time, especially from kids. And I think that the greatness of the painting has to do with the fact that Millet, who loves Shakespeare, understood something of the timeless, death-cheating vibrancy of Ophelia, where because of who she is in the play, she spills out into the unfinished and the unbegun, still lives actively in our culture, in our minds, in our hearts, our psyches, and our souls. So when Ophelia dies, when the queen tells the story of her drowning, I lost it the first 4 or 5 times I heard it, and I want to explain why. Hamlet was written in 1603, and while you have some ferociously strong, powerful, fiercely eloquent women, a lot of them in fact, Beatrice for one, it is Ophelia who carries a kind of verbal strength and dexterity and inner courage and audaciousness and even subversiveness with her that is so at odds with her sad and terrible fate when she's chastised by first her father and then her brother for being too close to Hamlet or to listen to his words of seduction with too credent ear. She responds, "I shall the lesson of your words take to my heart," or something like that. It's not exact. But then she says, and this is exact, "But good my brother, do not, as some ungracious pastors do, show me the sharp and thorny way to heaven, whilst thou, like a reckless libertine himself, the primrose path of dalliance treads, and recks not his own reed." Okay, what she's saying is, don't be a hypocrite, don't preach to me and have the same behaviors. But she goes so far beyond that because she's actually criticizing religious hypocrisy. Could my brother do not, like some ungracious pastors do, show me the steep and thorny way to heaven, whilst thou, like a reckless libertine himself, the primrose path of dalliance treads, and recks not his own rod, doesn't listen to his own preaching, but she does it in language so poetic and vibrant. It's amazing. And her daring and courage to stand up to her father, her brother, stand up to religious hypocrisy is so striking, and she carries on this verbal power even when inconsolable over the death of her father and inconsolable over the fact that Hamlet has gone from these sort of bad poems to her doubt that the stars are fire, doubt that the earth doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love you, and all these ministrations of affections to treating her like a common whore with a nonstop verbal barrage. Lady, it would show all these jokes on, it would cost you a groaning to take off mine edge, or your good kissing carrion. She really becomes meat to him in his grief over what he perceives as the betrayal of his mother and her sexual indiscretions. Ophelia takes it hard on both cheeks, but even at that point, still in her mad speech has an eloquence about her that is just astonishing. Her flower speech and the eloquence of that, or the raw, young men will do it if they can do it, by cock they are to blame. She is a powerhouse. So when I look at John Everett Millet's painting, I know in a narrative sense she's dead, but I also know she lives in our culture, and I keep thinking, I think it's Bob Dylan, "It's all right, Mom, I'm only sleeping." And Ophelia to me is only sleeping. Are there any people who have played a significant role in your Shakespeare journey? Yes, there are lots. I remember an early video by Ian McKellen when he was a quite young man. I think it was called Acting Shakespeare. And the sheer amount of energy that he brought into the subject of bringing Shakespeare alive was absolutely infectious. There's one particular scene where he performs the famous out brief candle speech from Macbeth in a thick Scottish dialect, which he believed approximated the Scots language in 1609 when the play was performed. And he goes, "Oot, oot, brave candle, life's but a poor player that struts and frets his oor on the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, I botched that. You should watch McKellen do it. But the process of defamiliarization of the language and giving it a sort of thick, earthy, somewhat witchy sound was just absolutely riveting to me. I loved him. There are so many books. There's a scholar who writes both about Romanticism and Shakespeare, Jonathan Bate. Absolutely love his work. Love the work on Shakespeare of Harold Bloom. I will talk about that in favorite books. But there are also some people who have performed Shakespearean magic. I will give you an example. Probably the weakest of all Shakespeare plays is Titus Andronicus. It is not really a horror. Instead, it's a slasher film or a bloodfest. It is a nasty, nasty play. Stagecraft has scenes like, oh, how do we get 8 severed limbs off the stage when there are only 4 intact limbs and 3 mouths, and one of them has had their tongue ripped out so they won't tell who violated them. And so there's this incredibly gory bit of messing around, and finally Lavinia, who has been violated in the most horrific ways, has her brother's lopped off hand put into her mouth and they trundle off the stage. It is a gore fest. But somehow the director, Julie Taymor, took that play and turned it into an absolute masterpiece. It is, in fact, one of my favorite Shakespeare films of all time. And so Julie Taymor is one of my unsung heroes. But I'm going to mention someone terribly unlikely, and it is the 19th century author, Herman Melville. I was reading all of Melville, reading or rereading, really, all of Melville in chronological order for a series of lectures on Melville and the visual arts. And I was amazed by how weak the early writing was. Now, I like just popular writing, and something does not have to be literature for me to enjoy it, but the gap between early sort of travel narratives and adventure yarns like Typee or Umu, and things like the Piazza Tales or Pierre or Moby Dick just seemed incomprehensibly immense. So I was looking at his life and I realized that the decisive thing was a single year where he dove very deep into Shakespeare. And the more I looked at that year, the more I realized that Melville had moved inside of the Shakespearean texts, that he had incorporated them almost as his own. He did a very strong reading and let all the linguistic pyrotechnics and all the personality studies and all the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful human raw stuff of our being flow into him. And so I got fascinated by the sort of process of Melville reading. And it became a figure for me of how empowering Shakespeare can be when we sort of maximally move into his universe of plays. So Herman Melville would be my choice for someone who has impacted my experience of Shakespeare. Question number 4, do you have any favorite books or films about Shakespeare? Well, my 2 favorite Shakespeare books are, I think, just extraordinary works. The first is by Harold Bloom, and it has the audacious title of Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human. You can look at the title and say, well, okay, so they weren't human in the days of Chaucer, or they weren't human in the day of Sophocles or Euripides. What is this? Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human. But actually, he makes a very elegant argument and supports it beautifully. And I totally buy it, that Shakespeare is the first author whose characters, when they speak, really listen to themselves. And there is a kind of internal dialectic of self-fashioning as you listen to yourself talk, respond to it, develop an interiority of consciousness that surpasses anything that has gone before. You're sort of watching the process of self-creation and self-fashioning. I think it's extraordinary. Sometimes in Shakespeare, you even see the sort of self-willed destruction of part of a personality in ways that modern theorists of sociopathy or aficionados of true crime should take note. Lady Macbeth, for example, wants to achieve a certain end and can't do it with her faculties of empathy or remorse intact. So we have a remarkable scene where Shakespeare takes us in the mind of the desiring and willful Lady Macbeth, and she says, "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the top to the toe full of direst cruelty." Fine, you see, fill me from top to toe full of direst cruelty. That's good, but watch what Shakespeare does. "Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murthering ministers." Now, as you all know, there's lots of interest in humors and the sort of symbolic significance of fluids, and breast milk was everywhere, a sort of sign of connection and the human life world and fecundity and rebirth. And even more dramatically in Macbeth, because you have that amazing image, "I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. I would while it were smiling in my face." And so you have invoked this image of sort of maximum bonding between a child and baby, and then the big reveal and the big horror. "I would while it were smiling in my face have" what? "Plucked my nipple from its boneless gums and dashed its brains out, had I so sworn as you have done to this." So Lady Macbeth clearly has a mind she is in control of and can push towards the most horrific thing. But watch the self-unmaking of Lady Macbeth. "Take my milk for gall, you murthering ministers. Make thick my blood and stop up the access and passage to remorse." How can you self-engineer yourself to let go of all empathy and guilt? But she does it. She's successful in it. It's horrific. Stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature step between the effect and it. Like, denaturalize me. I don't want to be a feeling, thinking human being. You know what? I want to be the wife of a king. Let's get it done. And so instead of just Shakespeare representing, say, an evil character or a trajectory of someone's fall, he takes us inside of that. And Shakespeare and the invention of the human. Harold Bloom, beautiful book. The other is a work by Jan Cott called Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. And really, it's the basic argument of the book that is so beautiful to me. And that is that Shakespeare always gets there before we do. And I think he's true. If you are trying to analyze the language and practice of love, you look at Shakespeare, oh boy, we're still trying to catch up with him. If you look at the subject of sociopathy that I just mentioned a second, you don't have to confine yourself to Lady Macbeth. Look at Othello and Iago in Othello and how he is truly a gleeful artist of mayhem. And you look at him and suddenly all the sociopaths and psychopaths and serial killers who have enjoyed taunting the people around them and playing mind games with the people around them, they're like, oh my gosh, it's Iago. It's Iago again. Iago loved verbally baiting people, but backing up just far enough that they didn't know they were being baited. And Iago has fun turning the world into a sea of mayhem and despair. So Shakespeare gets there first. Anything you look at. So Shakespeare, our contemporary, basically, Kant was arguing that how relevant Shakespeare is to political stresses in Eastern Europe at the time. But I tell you something, you read the history plays or watch productions of the history plays, and nothing that is going on in the White House or the Kremlin or in China, nothing is foreign to Shakespeare's understanding of human beings, whether it is the grasping after power or it is the ease with which people wear false faces when they have an end in stake, or the extent to which people can extirpate their own capacity for empathy and goodness when they're after a specific aim. And in the history plays, the aim of maintaining and extending one's domain of power becomes an excuse for all sorts of ruthless mayhem. So yes, the two books I would recommend, Harold Bloom, Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human, Jan Kott, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. The next question is absolutely fascinating. What actor from all of history would you like to have seen play Hamlet when in their prime? Roy gives the fascinating answer of Sarah Bernhardt, who he characterizes as a goth girl brilliantly because she was a sort of fin de siècle emblem of everything a little bit edgy and transgressive and bad and beautiful. And her Hamlet must have been absolutely stunning. So I don't mean to borrow too much from Roy, but I am going to pick another woman, have to explain why. Hamlet, of all characters from Shakespeare, and really I think of all characters in literature, is simply the brightest of them all. He is brilliant. His verbal dexterity, his perceiving absolutely everything around him. I mean, it must have been crazy to be Hamlet. He misses nothing, including all the subtleties. And Hamlet finds a way of saying exactly what he feels, even when he is caught in a sort of welter of ambivalent feelings. He, in a sense, has the most poetically charged and polysemous language of any character in all of Shakespeare. You can take a single line of Hamlet's and move into it and spin it out and all its resonances and evocative shadows, and he's just wonderfully. But you need a very bright actor or actress to play Hamlet. Now, one of my favorite living playwrights is a woman named Kate Mulvaney. I think she's absolutely brilliant, but she's primarily known for being an actress. And she has done things that are extraordinary to me, like made a short film on where she performs the role of Amelia from Othello. And if you've watched Othello 20 times, Amelia never jumps off as being the most vital of all characters. But Kate Mulvaney brings Amelia alive in a way that she lives in my heart. And Kate Mulvaney amazingly did a performance of Richard III, which I was only able to see snatches of, but it was so brilliant. It has changed and enriched Richard in my mind forever. So I would like to see that brilliant playwright tackle Hamlet. Maybe the most important question of the whole thing: what advice would you give someone intimidated by their first reading of Shakespeare? And the advice I would give is, first, don't read it at all. Go see a bunch of Shakespearean movies, and then the language will quite easily become natural and fluid and penetrative and accessible instead of alien and distancing. You will move inside of Shakespeare's production instead of being a spectator held at more distance than you want because of the oddities of Elizabethan language. Now, on that score, there are lots of paths to do it, and I sort of like the principle of a crash, immersive plunge into Elizabethan literature. One thing you can do is, if you read the Bible, read the King James Version, which was from 1611 and has essentially the same sort of linguistic base of Shakespeare's plays. Even better is read the earlier Geneva Bible, which is the Bible that Shakespeare himself would have read. And that's a wonderful way of gaining some sort of fluidity with Elizabethan language. Another thing is there are lots of playwrights at the time doing outstanding work besides Shakespeare, and immerse yourself a little bit in the works of Thomas Kidd or Middleton, who is just great. Watch something like The Revenger's Tragedy, and you will just find yourself in this dark, depraved world of Jacobean culture where sex and transgressive behavior and political intrigue became the norm. The Duchess of Malfi, there's some astonishing performances of it. And those plays will help sort of familiarize you to the linguistic world of Shakespeare. If you are a true crime aficionado, watch Arden of Faversham. It's badass and a very, very close look at a true crime, and it's fun. So that's another thing. Immerse yourself in Elizabethan and Jacobean culture. Another one is get straight in your head that the whole edifice of Shakespeare as great literature is a cultural construction. If you go back to Shakespeare's time, he was writing popular entertainment. That's what he did. When Shakespeare died, there weren't any books of his plays published. They existed in quarto form, which is like the cheapest paperback in your library. They were thought of as ephemera. And if a couple fellow playwrights hadn't come along years after he died and collected all the quartos they could find and put out the first folio, we wouldn't have a lot of the plays that we have. And the point there is that these were things meant to be seen and enjoyed. All right, what's another bit of advice? If you're interested in history, there are some fabulous productions of the history plays, some of which were published in serial form and go on for a long, long time. In fact, there was, in the 1960s, Peter Hall did a series called The War of the Roses, which is the whole first tetralogy, which is Henry VI, part 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. And as far as relevant political intrigue, you never have something that's that direct and dark and duplicitous, with all these machinations of Machiavellian characters continually at war to maintain their power and increase it. It is a fascinating production. The Hollow Crown, which covers the same territory of the first tetralogy, which Roy mentioned, is one of my favorite Shakespeare productions of all time. It is, however, so heavily edited and shortened. It is just a condensed, compressed version of Henry VI, 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. I wish that they had stretched it out a little longer. Now, if you like history and are a bit ambitious and have something like Audible, a remarkable series put together, I think, in the late 1970s is called Vivat Rex. Vivat Rex takes all of Shakespeare's history plays, both the first tetralogy and the second tetralogy, and Henry VIII, and takes us all the way from Edward through to the birth of Elizabeth. Now you can say, well, wait a second, there is no play that deals with the reign of Edward by Shakespeare, and that's quite true. What they have done is also include works by other Renaissance writers in the unfolding saga. And Edward, we get Christopher Marlowe, which is appropriate because there's some nasty stuff going on there, and Marlowe is very, very good at that. But what you get is this marshaling of extraordinary actors and actresses and this unfolding saga of British history that is absolutely fascinating. And you see it as this sort of never-ending story. And the thing about it is, if you have the patience to listen to it, and they're wonderful sort of joys of listening, if you have the patience, you will come out transformed in your ability to understand Shakespeare and other Elizabethan writers. Because by the time you get through all of them, something like Hamlet or Othello or Measure for Measure feels like you are drinking spring water. It goes down very, very easily. All right. Another thing is, there, after Kenneth Branagh did his Henry V, which of course some people are critical of and prefer Olivier's, but I'm all on the side of Branagh. He made that film so accessible. And after that, there were a flurry of sort of medium to large budget movies dramatizing Shakespeare plays, and some of them are so over the top wonderful. All right, I'm going to tell you a couple odd ones that I love. If you ever like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Joss Whedon, the director of that series, did what is my favorite single production of a Shakespeare comedy. His Much Ado About Nothing is moving and engaging and going back to the talk about Shakespeare as a conversational, the most sort of easily conversational of any Shakespeare movie I've ever seen. And it is just an absolute treasure. So Josh Whedon, Much Ado About Nothing, very high. Another thing, I think I mentioned Julie Taymor took that awful play, Titus Andronicus, turned it into an absolute masterpiece. Watch that. It is just spellbinding and eye-opening. The actor Al Pacino has had a go at Shakespeare several times, and he made one of the oddest films about Shakespeare I've ever seen called Looking for Richard. Critics absolutely hated it. I loved it. But he also did a version of The Merchant of Venice, which I find absolutely spellbinding. So, watch a lot of movies, and Shakespeare will become your friend and even your intimate. Next question, deliver your favorite speech or soliloquy from a Shakespeare play. There are too many, and I'm going to fudge. I'm going to do a sonnet instead. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble death heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him, with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet in these thoughts, myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day, arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate, for thy sweet love, remembered, such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. When you read Shakespeare yourself, you should pay attention to the advice that Shakespeare gives the court players, the actors, when they come visiting to Elsinore. He says, speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it as your court players do, I as lief the town criers spoke my lines. What are town criers? They're the people who walk around shouting out the important news that people have to hear. Earthquake coming, it's the end of the world. Murder in Highgate, right? You want to experience Shakespeare as a set of conversations, people talking to each other. It goes on, do not saw the air too much with your hands, because in the very torrent and tempest, and as I may say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Now, Shakespeare's one of the most emotional writers of all time, but if you imagine yourself, say, returning from college to Elsinore, and your father is dead and you think he's been murdered by your uncle, and your uncle, who you do not like, is now king of Denmark, and you are in court and you're basically being told, Hamlet, give up the moody brooding, you're going to be rather upset. So when the queen says, thou know'st 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity, I, madam, it is common. If it be so, why seems it so particular with thee? Seems, madam? Nay, I know not seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor the windy suspiration of the breath, nor the fruitful river in the eye, nor the dejected haviour of the visage that can denote me truly. These indeed seem, and they are actions that a man might play, but I have that within which passeth show, these but the trappings of the suits of woe. And you realize Hamlet is talking about this impossible gulf between what he is feeling inwardly and anything that he is actually able to say, but you realize that he heals that gulf by his own verbal dexterity and his use of poetic resources. And in that speech, I'll just give you one tiny example. He talks about, there's not the windy suspiration of forced breath. Well, if you say that line to yourself, the very words, the sound of the words are performing the very thing it's describing. He's talking about active talk and active breathing, windy suspiration of forced breath, and the very words that Shakespeare stitches together to create that image are breath words in the most intense sense. You put your hand in front of your mouth when you say that, windy suspiration of forced breath, and it's as if you are blowing your words out. And so he achieves a sort of marriage of a somatic or physiological mirroring of the very words that are being performed. And that is something that Shakespeare does all the time. So pay attention to the sound of the thing. The sound communicates meaning as much as the semantic meaning of what is being said. So those are two bits of advice. Forget Shakespeare in terms of that cultural edifice. You have to remember that when Shakespeare was writing plays, he was essentially an Elizabethan screenwriter. People didn't collect his plays as books at all. In fact, when he died in 1616, there were no books of his plays at all. There were something called quartos, which, think of the cheapest paperback you've ever had, ragged and scrappy and printed not to last through the years, but as basically the cheapest ephemera you can find. And that's what existed as far as his plays. Now, as far as his sonnets and his poetry, like Venus and Adonis or Rape of Lucrece, there were printed editions. There were Shakespeare books in circulation, but if not for something called the First Folio, which gathered together all those quartos and printed them up in more permanent form, we wouldn't have a lot of Shakespeare plays that exist. Well, the point isn't the greatness of the First Folio. The point is that Shakespeare wrote to have people experience his plays as popular entertainment at the theater. And we really should experience Shakespeare as fun and popular entertainment and not as written works by the greatest writer of literature of all time. That creates a sort of daunting separation from Shakespeare. And the fact is that Shakespeare is one of the most audience engaging writers of all time. To go a little further with Hamlet's own advice on how to perform and experience the plays, when he says, in the very torrent, tempest, and as I may say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Do not saw the air too much with your hands, but use all gently. And basically what he's saying is that histrionic acting is anathema to experiencing the intimacy of the play. The scene we were just looking at where Hamlet is in court at Elsinore and nobody is understanding his own emotional intensity or his experience gets ratcheted up in such a dramatic way when the king displays a staggering obliviousness and leaves with everyone else this gentle and unforced accord of Hamlet's sits smiling to my heart. So to apply Shakespeare's own advice on how to experience the plays, how to act the plays, is in the very torrent, tempest, and as I may say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Basically, he's saying that a histrionic, overly dramatic style of acting is anathema to experiencing the intimacy of the play and the conversational exchange between the characters. Now, there is an emotional intensity in Shakespeare and a sort of dramatic arc of feeling that is so often ratcheted up to extraordinary peaks. But when Hamlet has given his "'tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black" speech, indicating that he is drastically misunderstood by everyone around him, king and queen ratcheted up even further by missing the point and concluding this gentle and unforced accord of Hamlet's "sits smiling to my heart, come, let's away." And the whole court departs and Hamlet is left alone on stage to try and give verbal expression to the full measure of his grief and his sorrow. It's an extraordinary speech. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Fie in it, fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature possess it merely, that it should come to this. But 2 months dead, not so much, not too so excellent a king as was this Hyperion to a satyr. So the point is that if you see a theatrical production and it's, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, it's one thing. But Hamlet's really talking to you. And he's saying, I am just absolutely besieged with grief. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. And as with any friend you're talking to, a friend you're listening to, there's a kind of verbal excess in it. In fact, we don't even know if the word was too solid, too sallied. Sallied is to journey forth and be forever sort of in exile from a sense of home and being at home, or sullied in the sense of being besmirched and tainted, which is something that is absolutely haunting Hamlet's mind. He can't think about the human life world without getting a sense of how tainted it is with his mother's own transgressions. He cannot tune his imagination off, and things like the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, hunting and making love over the nasty sty. Well, if you've ever seen a pigsty, that is how he imagines his mother and his stepfather. And if you really play out the image, the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, that is a soaked mattress over the braying, rutting sounds of pigs at play in their little shit fest. It's an extraordinary image. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Roy, thank you so much for tagging me. As far as Shakespeare goes, it looks fabulous, and I'm going to check it out. If anyone has any Shakespeare questions, please leave them in the comment. And please, everyone, check out the October event, Occult Detective October. I predict it is going to be one of the best events ever on BookTube. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It makes a difference. Have a great day.